Hello everybody, it's Sunday night, it's VR o'clock. Simple Interactions is the name of the game today. We'll look at pre-configured XR Origin. There is one that's built into the package I have generated for you that's better than the one I built. Adding hands into your project and how that can be useful. The use of haptics, again, making sure you're using the defaults in an appropriate way. Velocity tracking versus instantaneous object tracking, and a solution to a problem that will arise. Simple interactors for things like doors, socket interactors, being able to use events so when you socket something, something else may happen, and then poke interactions. So let's get on with it. I've got a scene set up already, which is effectively the sample scene you guys will have seen, just with a few test things set up. I've got a door set up over here that we're going to be using in a minute, but let's just go into VR and see what we can do. Right now I've got the basic cube, which is an instantaneous cube. You can see it comes with issues. You will however notice as well that I've got these little red dots which weren't there before, but notice some of the interesting behaviours I've got here. Now that's obviously a very peculiar behaviour, but that's demonstrating that it's working with poke interaction. I've also got some interaction set up over here, and you can see that that button knows that I'm poking it, using the poke interaction, which we're going to look at in a moment. So that can again of course be useful in its own way. So as you'll notice on the scene right now, I've got my standard XR Origin. This is the one that I created for you, and if you're using my preset template, that's what you'll kind of get out of the box. However, there's some more interesting things that are included. If you are moving from one scene to another, or you're creating your second scene in your game perhaps, you'll notice the XR Origin, you'll either have to copy paste, or you'll have to pull it in from elsewhere. So if I just deactivate the XR Origin, that's the one that comes within the sample package I've created, and if you again just search again in your package here for XR Origin pre-configured, there you go, XR Origin pre-configured, and I'm just going to drag and drop that into the scene. What this does, for those who haven't seen this already, it's a complete working, walking, turning system that includes a lot of features that may not already be in there, including some other features as well. So the difference between my one and this one is under the left and the right hand controllers, they have all of the individual controllers already set up for things like ray interactions, teleportation and poking, which we'll talk about in a second, but it's also got the XR controller information as well. So if I click into the left hand, you'll see that this looks a little bit different to the left hand on our provided sample, and you've got options down here for do we want smooth motion enabled, which means smooth movement. If I turn that off, it will default to teleportation, and if I go into the right hand, you'll see that smooth turn is not enabled, which means the snap turning is switched on, and I've got a bunch of settings in here as well for the controllers. Worth pointing out that both of these controllers has this grab move provider, which is something my one doesn't. And if I go to the XR pre-configured, you'll see that we've got our character controller driver, which we need, our character controller, which is our little green tic tac, but it's also got two-hand grab move provider, dynamic move provider, and a bunch of other stuff that perhaps we haven't seen before. So let me show you how this is different, why this may be suitable for you, why it may not be. Notice that within the controllers, it will break as soon as you put it on your head. So I'm looking through the headset right now, and though my head is turning, my view isn't, and it's really quite disconcerting. Whenever you use the pre-configured XR controller, you need to add a component to it. So I'm doing this at the XR Origin pre-configured level. What I need to add is an input action manager, and then I need to choose an action asset. I'm going to click plus, click the little circle, and I've got a bunch to choose from, but the one we want, I'm using version 2.3 of the XR Origin. I hope you guys have updated it as well. If you haven't, go watch my video that says watch me after Christmas if you haven't already watched it. But you can see down here, this is the XR Origin for 2.3.0 pre-release number 1. Now if I give that a play, all of my inputs should be operational. So I can move, I can turn, so far exactly no different to what I'd got before. However, now by default, haptics are working. Haptics, the vibration, I hover over something, something that is selectable, I get haptics, which is a nice, ultimately a nice thing to have. So that's the kind of thing that we've got. Doesn't really look a lot different, and keep in mind as well, if you've still got issues with your layers, like I've got here, that's something you still need to make sure you resolve. So, novel. You'll also see that peculiar behaviour there. I knocked myself into space by grabbing a physics object and not telling my XR origin that it needs to belong to the layer of whatever, which we'll sort in a second. But the other problem is, by default, the XR origin has a bunch of settings here, and one of them is, if I go to the continuous move provider, wherever that is, I can never find the blasted thing. Continuous move provider, it will be here somewhere. I'll find it eventually, but I'll come back to that one a little bit later. Suffice to say, we'll deal with that one in a minute. However, what we've got here at the minute is we've got our object and we've got our unusual interactions, so let's go and sort that. Whenever you've got interactions with a physics object, make sure you've got a layer for your player and a layer for anything that is grabbable. So I've just got player and grab. I'm going to select the XR origin pre-configured and make sure that is on the player layer. I do not want to change the children, so no, this object only. And any objects I wish to be grabbable, I'm going to put on the grab layer. Keep in mind, what we can now do is go to edit and project settings, and under the physics option you can scroll down to the physics matrix and say that you don't want things that are grabbable to interact with your player's boundaries, and that's exactly what we've done there. So let's just have a quick look here. One more option: snap turn provider, locomotion system, continuous turn provider, dynamic move. Right. In the pre-configured version, they renamed continuous move provider to dynamic move provider because things weren't complicated enough. What you'll notice here, by default, gravity application mode. Gravity only applies when you're trying to move, which to me is ridiculous. Gravity should apply immediately. I don't know why that's not the default. And you've got some other options as well. I'll show you what else this does out the box that perhaps you may need, maybe you don't want. I'm just going to grab a, under XR, all I'm going to do is grab a teleport area. Why not? Little teleport area. What this is just a flat plane. Currently it's under the floor. There you go. It's just a flat plane. And this hooks in to the teleportation actions already built in. Now, the way teleportation works on this default object is you hold down your right thumbstick and you get a little teleportation grid. And if it's an acceptable area to teleport onto, it'll let you do that. Okay, so it should just be a case of setting up a teleportation area. Because teleportation isn't on by default, if I go to the XR pre-configured option, I've got teleportation provider. What's wrong with you? Teleportation area. In the spirit of all things I tend to do off the cuff, this should work. XR, let's put a teleportation anchor in here instead. So the difference between a teleportation area is any point on it should be teleportable, whatever you want to call it, whereas a teleportation area has a child, which is whenever you choose an area, it will always snap you to the anchor point pointing that direction, which can be very desirable. I'll just try and get this working. If not, I'm not going to bother too much time on it. And it should just work when you tap. Don't know why it's not. There you go. Sorry, so it still responds to trigger. So I've got the teleportation button held down, and then I press trigger and it teleported me. So I'm going to go over here and there you go. I had to use the grip button to get it to fire, which feels a bit weird, but that's how it's set up for some reason. So that, and then trigger, and it seems to work somehow. Maybe you want it, maybe you don't. The other features that it's got that you may or may not find desirable out the box is you can grab your world now. So if I grab with my right hand and pull, and my left hand and pull, it feels a bit like I'm swimming. And I can also use this to control my rotation. So all I'm doing, I'm not turning my head, I'm just kind of moving the two controllers with the grip buttons held down, which feels weird. And you can also kind of like pull the world towards you as if you're swimming. I cannot imagine a circumstance where that's useful, so let's turn that off. So with the XR Origin pre-configured, you can turn a bunch of stuff off. I do not want the two-hand grab move provider, turn it off. I don't want under the left hand and the right hand controller grab move provider, turn it off, and that should solve that problem. So that is the pre-configured XR Origin and how it's useful. Very, very powerful tool. Comes with a bunch of stuff we're going to look at in a moment. Hands! On the Moodle page, under the Assignment 6 resources, you'll find Oculus Hands Complete. It's an alright little package, so I'm going to just grab that package here, snap it into Unity, into the asset space, and it just imports it like you would an asset from the asset store. I built this last year. I'm not entirely happy with it because I don't think the positioning is quite right, but let me show you how it works. In the Oculus Hand folder, in the prefabs folder, you have lefty and righty. They're green by default. If you want to change their material, just go into the materials folder and change the colour of the hands to be whatever you want. Maybe it's an option for your player, they can choose a different option and that just changes the material that's loaded, entirely up to you. The way you get these working on lefty and righty is under the left hand, under the XR controller. What you find here is under the model, just above the grab move provider, is that spawning in the controller model. Now in your tutorial, makes a lot of sense to show the player the controller, but maybe in the game you don't want that option instead, so you could swap that out for the hands. So if I just go to prefabs and I've got lefty and righty, so left hand selected, and I'm going to replace the model with left hand, and I'm going to replace the right hand, rather unsurprisingly, with the right hand model. And what you'll find is you just get your 3D model in front of you. You may find the scale is a touch too big. Okay, and the reason why that didn't spawn in straight away is it's what I'm also going to do is grab left hand and make it a child of the left hand, and right hand and make it as a child of the right hand. Sorry, so under the XR controller, there we go. So in this instance it actually is already spawning in. Under the left hand you've got the XR controller left and XR controller right, which is the actual 3D model that you're seeing. So I'm just going to select both of those and deactivate them. That's the 3D model that we saw there. I've just swapped the model out as well and dragged that in as a child. So now what we can see are two hands. You can see the purple lines coming out of them, which are the poke interactors, and they're animated with some default animations you may find useful. Grip button, grips. If you grip and you trigger, you get a fist. And they should still work with direct interaction or ray interaction, if that's the behaviour that you're looking for. I think I turned the ray interactors off, but you get the idea. So what we've now got, one thing I would point out though with the hands, really important deal. The reason why the ray interactors did not work is both the left hand and the right hand and the prefabs, which means you'd also have to change them here for the left hand model and right hand model. They have a sphere collider on them that is not a trigger, so that's why the ray interaction wasn't working, because it was hitting the sphere collider of the hand. So just remove both of those. Kind of an important deal. Let's just make sure that works, because we always test, we never trust. No, still broke, don't know what I've done. Oh well. Genuinely wonder why. It's colliding with something. One last try. Let's just see, is it spawning in the model? So all I'm going to do here really quickly, I'm going to go back to left hand and right hand, and I'm going to turn off that model. I'm going to set the models back to none, because what I think it was doing was spawning in the model while also having the models in scene. Does that fix our problem? Yeah, no, we'll come back to that later. Find out why that's not working. So that's added hands, but we need to come back to it because I've broken it. Haptics. So an important aspect of any of your game is knowing that under both of your controllers, so the left hand and the right hand, under the XR controller, you've got a series of options. So there's a bunch of options that you've got here under the controller, like managing it, and that's all set by default, like your animations and whatnot. But if I select any of these grabbable objects, like I've got this test box here which contains this XR grab interactable, I want to just remind you all, one of the most important features here is the interactable events, interactable filters. So events we're going to look at in a second when we deal with our door, and filters we don't really use very much, but they're still there nonetheless. If I go back to the XR origin, we've got a bunch of options up here for continuous move, rotation, locomotion, snap, turn. Just trying to find where they've moved haptics to. Used to be under here under the controller. They have moved it. Is it under this interaction group? Poke, direct, ray? They're under the individual interactors. Sorry, my fault. So under the direct interactor, ray interactor, and poke interactors, you've got the individual haptic events. So when you select something, when you hover over it, you've got the haptic values which are set by default. So if you're after some extra credits for getting haptics, they're set. But don't forget as well, you can change the values, change the intensity, change the duration, and they can be different depending on type of interactor, because whether you direct, ray, poke, teleport, or whatever it is that you want. But the audio events are also there. So if you want it to make a little audio cue when you select something or when you hover over something, but only when it's using the direct grab one, you can just put an audio clip in there and it will play it only once. Really powerful little tool, and I want people to be using those audio events. Very important. So that's basically haptics in a nutshell, just reminding you that it's there and that I want you guys to use it. The only other thing about haptics that I'll point out is, let's say you've got a button over here. By default, a button will interact with the ray interactor, and the player will be able to press the button, but it won't actually respond to haptics. It won't vibrate like you would do if you're hovering over one of your grabbable objects. In order to get that to work, it has to have an XR simple interactable, which we're going to look at in more detail in a second, and it must also have a collider. So I've just added a simple interactable, and I've added a box collider around this object, and then that should make haptics fire in the same way it would for any other object. Really good for your main menus, just adding a little bit more punch. So I can feel there, I've got a bit of vibration happening, and can change what happens there with the ray interactors. I'm genuinely trying to figure out why this ray interactor is not working. Oh well, doesn't affect us for the next bit we want to do. Which ties in with, again, using simple interactors. Let's do this bit first. Velocity tracking versus instantaneous. You could see here with this object that I've got, if I pick that object up, I can push it through the floor, I can drop it. It's not great. So for any object that you've got, I always recommend changing its rigid body to discrete. So from discrete to continuous speculative. And then under the grab interactable, you've got its movement type. Instantaneous is the default. So I'm going to make a duplicate of this object. One on the left is instantaneous. One in the middle I'm going to set to velocity tracking. And I'm just going to keep the defaults as they appear. And I'm going to show you the difference between the two and why one may be more desirable than the other. If I walk over to this object and grab it, you can see I can poke it through the table and potentially push it through the floor and let go. So that's not great if you've got a key item and the player can potentially lose it. I'm going to grab this velocity tracked item. You can see the lag that it appears because it's now a physics item, and it kind of feels that it's a bit springy. But watch what happens when I try and push it through the table. I can't unless I really try. I actually don't think I can pull it through. It's very springy. So this is very desirable to stop the player being able to push items through doors or walls or something like that, and to stop players doing that. But you've got this horrible motion, and especially when you move and you turn, it's really obviously that that's unusable. There's nothing built in to the XR toolkit to fix it. However, I've got you covered. I've written a little script, which is here. I'll leave it just on for a second. I've just called it velocity fix. Any object you apply this to that uses velocity tracking, this will repair that horrible motion. Just keep in mind, if you do apply it to any object and it's got velocity tracking on, remember that this must have it. The only thing that's going on here, I've got the same old stuff we have in every script. I've got the name of the script, I've got on start, and I've got this get component rigid body. So all I'm doing here is get component rigid body max angular velocity equals 20. Today's not a good day for my computer. What's going on here? That code works though. Get component rigid body max angular velocity. I think I've just done my own mistake of... No, it's talking to Visual Studio. Why are you not happy? Oh well. I'm going to drag that onto the object in the middle. That's now got our velocity fix code, which I'll just put back on screen for a second. I don't know why Visual Studio is having a right old moment here. The code is fine. Really confused by Visual Studio today. So all we're doing is getting component of type rigid body, and we're setting its max angular velocity to 20. That's it, and we're doing that when it starts. Literally all we are doing. And now with that fix applied, let's see if that object is now more better behaved. I go and grab it. Still a little jerky, but it should be a little bit crisper than it was a moment ago. We can now see that we can move things around. That's not as crisp as it's been in my previous test, so I'm curious why that is. I'm just going to turn the hands off for a second. I've got a feeling the hands are giving me undesirable interactions here. So just going back to the controllers for a moment, and I'm going to see if that works better. No, can't grab them anyway. Nope, that's still pretty shocking. If anything, worse. How very interesting. Once I've found the better settings for it, like I said, I've tested this on a previous thing and it's worked absolutely fine. So I've got my velocity fix script. Now the code's fine. What were you playing at? Getting the rigid body and setting its max angular velocity to 20. I'm going to try doing that on a wake to see if it will make any difference. Again, if it doesn't work, I'm just going to write it off as a bad test today. Still far from perfect. So I've got the instantaneous one, and you can possibly see the difference as I'm turning. You can definitely see the difference, and maybe this is a desirable feature, maybe it isn't, but that should work. It's a thing I've said far too many times, and isn't. Don't know why. There you go, I can spell the word start. just for testing, you're on the grab layer, you're on the grab layer, you're on the grab layer. I'm going to turn the pre-configured one off, turn the XR origin back on, player layer only for you. Let's do some debugging. You need to skip past this bit till I find the solution, guys. Nope, still atrocious. Oh well. I'll figure it out. I'll do another video. So, moving on. You can see the options, and that code fix again should work. I've tested it in another example and it worked absolutely fine. I have no idea why that is not working in the way I would expect. Just going to try changing that to discrete, maybe. Setting you back to single. One last quick test. Nah, still absolutely shocking. Oh well. I want to get into the main thing I really want to show you now, which is in simple interactions with things like doors. I've got a door set up over here on the left hand side. It's a very simple little model. I've got a door which contains the door frame, which is just those 3 cubes. I've got a door hinge, which is an empty game object, which contains a cube. One thing I want to highlight, if you guys have never seen this behaviour before, notice how the door hinge has a scale of 1, 1, 1, whereas the cube itself, which represents the door, has been scaled down to the size that I want to represent the door. Watch what happens if I were to scale the door to be perhaps wider. Notice how I'm changing the door hinge here. And if I rotate the door hinge, I'll get some very peculiar behaviours as it rotates around. And this may not be apparent here, but you always want to make sure that your parent object is always scaled at 1, 1, 1, and then you can scale the child to be whatever you like as a part of it, because it gives you some unusual behaviours. So what we've now got here is this door. One thing it doesn't currently have is a handle. So on the cube, which represents the child, represents the door itself, I'm going to create an empty 3D object. Going to be a cube, something to represent the door handle, and I'm just going to make that quite small. Perhaps it's one of those big push bar things. Maybe it's a fire escape. There you go. It's a fire escape door. But it could be a handle, it could be whatever. It really does not matter. All I'm going to add to this object is an XR simple interactable, just like I was dealing with over with the button. And the simple interactable, again, the interactable events are the things we care about. When the user interacts with this object, what should happen? So I've got an on activate, I've got an on select, I've got an on hover. Maybe you want it in your game when the player hovers over something, it performs an action, but in this case I want it to be when I walk over to it and select it, which is I press the grab button. So when I select with this, something is going to happen, and what's going to happen is the door hinge will animate. So very quickly, I'm going to create an animation. You guys should have seen this 1,000 times by now. And all this animation is going to do is go from the closed to the open. You can see there's a bit of a gap there between the hinge. I really could not care less. And that's all it's going to do. Important to remember that with this door, the door open animation is what will play by default, and if I double click on it, you'll also see that it will loop, which is not a behaviour that I want. What I am going to do very quickly though is I was just going to ignore a problem I've introduced, but no, let's do it properly. I'm going to remove that animator there because I put it in the wrong place. Whenever you've got an object and you're animating it, it should always be on the parent object. I put it on the door hinge by mistake, so if you've got a similar layout to me, right click on the animator on door hinge and remove it. I'm going to click back on door, the parent. I'm going to override door open animation. Yes, override it please. And I'm just going to quickly recreate it. Remember, you can animate any child of the parent object. The reason why that's a big deal is if I'd have moved my door, the animation wouldn't have played correctly. So that's not what I want. Now we've corrected that, back to the door. And on the animator, I don't want door open to play automatically. I want an empty state, which is going to become the default state. And I can keep it really simple here for something like just door open. If I had door open and door closed, I would do this in a slightly different way. I'd kind of follow the tutorial where I did animation basics. But here I'm going to keep it really simple. No code at all. Okay, so you can see here the animation will start, door will not open. I'm going to double click on it because I don't want it to loop, so loop time is off. What I'm now going to tell is this bar at the front, the simple interactable, when it is selected, I've already pressed the little push, what object do I want to do something? Well, the door, please. Then, what do I want it to do? Well, I want to tell the animator to play, and I'm choosing string. And what do I want it to play? The door open animation, please. Simple as that. You could also add it on activate if you wanted the player to walk over to it but press the grip button perhaps, or grip and trigger. Or you could replace it on hover, like I've said. All of these events do something. And you've also got select exited. Maybe if you wanted this to be a really springy door, on select it played the door open animation, on exited it played door close or something like that. Or maybe if you've got a blend, it would not blend, what I'm looking for, if you had a condition transition. So I'm going to walk over to this door, I'm going to press trigger, and there you go, it's played that animation. In a future video I'd like to do something like a more robust, propping it open with your hand and something like that, but you get the idea. So as a simple animation you can't get much simpler than that. But simple isn't always great. Let's have a look at how we can spice this up a little bit. So currently I'm going to remove that on select. Actually no, I'll keep it, it's not going to hurt anybody. But I'm going to make a key card for this door now. By the side of the door I'm going to create a little cube object, and this is going to represent a keycard slot or something, handprint, something like that. Player has to put a keycard in there in order for things to work. So let's do card reader. I'm going to create a cube. Massive blasted cube. And this is going to be a grabbable object that will go in the card reader. What colour should you be? Blue. Why not? There you go. So the idea is that card's going to go in the card reader, and when that happens the door will open. In order to socket something like that, we're going to use a socket interactor. So on the card reader I'm going to create a child of that, which is going to be under, as just right clicked, XR socket interactor, which is a separate little child. By default it's a sphere collider, but you can change that. If you want a box collider, just delete it and replace it with a box collider. Just remember it must be a trigger or this won't work. The thing that makes this really useful is by default any grabbable object will socket into that socket interactor. That may not be desirable. You only want this thing to socket if it's the keycard going into it. So the interaction layer mask, this socket currently accepts everything. But I'm going to add a layer, interaction layers, and I'm going to add one for key card. I can put spaces in here, I can do uppercase, lowercase, doesn't matter, it's just a string of text. So if I go back to the socket interactor, which is my card reader, I can now choose, I don't want anything to go in here apart from the key card. It's the only thing that will be accepted. And over here I'm going to add an X, I'll grab interactable like we normally do. That will add my rigid body, which I'm going to set to continuous speculative. There's my grab interactable, and here you can also see the interaction layer mask. I want it to be default and keycard. So that is like your way of managing what goes in what. All I'm now going to say, let's test that works before we do anything else. Rotations may need changing. The socket interactor, I may have to move it around to make this look good, but let's just show you as a quick job. I've got my socket interactor, and oh yeah, it comes with this behaviour by default, the XR interaction pre-configured one. I'll show you how to fix that later. Let's go and socket there. You get a nice little visual for what it's going to look like, and it's socketed. And that will be the only grabbable item that is socketing. If I go back to the socket interactor though, like I said, I noticed that it was rotated 90 degrees the wrong axis. So let's just rotate that back around. That should now position properly. But what I'm interested in is under the interactor events, what should happen when something is either hovered over the socket or selected, as in goes into the socket. Well, do you know what? When that thing is socketed, I want to tell the door to play its animation, just like we were doing. Play string, and I'm sure it was called door open. Was it called door open? Door space open, right. So now socketing that in should play the door open animation. So I pick up the key card, I put it in the socket, and it plays the door open. Really powerful little tool, works for locks, works for key cards, works for anything like that. And notice how little code that took. And if you want something simple, that'll do 90% of what people want. While we're here though, if you're still interested in how sockets can be powerful, let's do more stuff with sockets. What I'm going to do here though is I'm going to start with the keycard socketed to something. So I'm going to just create a simple game object, XR socket interactor, and this socket interactor is going to sit on the table. Notice how it's invisible, doesn't have a mesh, it's just literally a collider. There you go, it's going to sit on the table, and if anything was nearby it would kind of hoover it up and it would get socketed to it. But again, I want to say here only nothing but the key card can socket to it. What's interesting here is you've got your starting interactable. Starting selected interactable. If you want something, no matter where it is in your scene, to start in a socket, really good for holsters for guns or magazines or stuff like that, you want that to start socketed to something, you can just choose from the list, or you can drag it from the drop down. Was the cube the right thing? Yes, it was. So now the starting selected interactable, game looks like this, game loads, that thing will automatically get socketed over here. That's powerful. But what I'm now interested in saying is when something leaves that socket, something should happen. Now you can write a script for doing this, maybe a light should turn on, or you want an event to happen, or in many people's cases you want a jump scare to occur. Maybe you go and pick the, I'm thinking Indiana Jones here, you pick the secret item up and something then happens or something animates. Exactly the same trick here. All I'm going to do for simplicity is just say something like, there is a light, let's turn you into a point light, there you go, there's a light somewhere. It's a light, it's a red light, there you go. This light is off, however when the socket interactor has something exited from it, I'm going to tell the light, tell its game object to set active and turn it on. So once I remove the item from this, something should happen. So you can see it automatically socketed, I remove it and the red light came on. And I should still be able to socket it back to the socket interactor that's there. But I can't socket anything else into it. I can't socket this over there. Won't let me do it, won't even give me the little preview saying that it's acceptable. Again, notice, because I'm using lost tracking, can't push it through. Whereas the cube, which is instantaneous, I absolutely can. If this were to be a solid wall, let's say, and the player were to accidentally kind of push their key card through and drop it, it's game over for them because they can't pick that up, it'd be on the other side of the wall. So it's an important decision to make as to what works for you. Like I said, I'm quite annoyed that that fix hasn't worked. It should have done. There's no reason why it shouldn't. I really can't see what the problem is. I'm just going to make it so it's not a child of the environment. Maybe that's playing up. Nope, still ugly as sin. I'll get to the bottom of what I've done. But there you go, Socket Interactors using events. Very quickly, let's have a look at poking. All I've got set up on this item over here, the one that's got the really weird animation, is it's got a simple interactable, or a grab interactable, it doesn't hurt, whatever you want. It's also got an XR poke follow affordance, and it's also got a poke filter. What this means is your poke interactors, which come with the XR origin pre-configured, says, do we want to socket everything? Yep, so what interactions we've got. But by default, it should require a poke filter, meaning you can only poke things with a poke filter as well as a poke affordance. And that's basically what I've set up here. And because this item over here, this button, also has an XR poke follow affordance and an XR poke filter, I can walk over to it and poke it. So if I turn off my ray interactors, which have obviously got quite a long range on them, so if I turn those ray interactors off, I should now only have the little poke things coming out. So you see I don't have ray interaction anymore, but I can still direct grab things. But if I go over here and poke it, hopefully, here it's playing a little animation as I poke it. So it's kind of pushing out the way. So maybe that's desirable, maybe you want that kind of poke interaction. And you've also got some other settings for it as well. Because that poke still fires off any action events or anything like that, you can just say on poke something happens. So with my button selected here, you can see that it's supposedly changing on the X. So what's happening here is the X axis, which is this direction, that's the way it's expecting the poke to come from, the kind of with your finger. And you've got some other settings here so you can change what happens with it, and it should move a little bit, but it's moving on an axis we hadn't considered. So we can set a poke configuration, which is this. The depth offset, how far away you can be from it before it pokes, the collider, which will be the default, and you've also got the affordance, which is what's moving it. So you've got the return to initial condition, and you've got this as well. So if I change that smoothing speed, it'll either be really rapid now as we poke it, or really slow. Really rapid, too rapid, you can see it's going all the way up there. And I'm just going to change that smoothing speed like so. Can you see quite an interesting motion on it? Maybe that's desirable, maybe it isn't. Okay, that's everything I really wanted to cover today, everybody. Hopefully that's been useful. Look forward to seeing you again soon.